Everybody, and welcome to Karma Academy, and today we're going to be talking about Handlock. And one of the first things you want to know about Handlock is that it's a control deck. And what I mean by a control deck is that it's a deck that focuses more on stalling in the early game with low creatures and spells, board clears, and trying to take over mid-game with big creatures and scale into late game with larger creatures that overwhelm your opponent and win you the game by controlling the board. That's basically what a control deck is, and Handlock is the ultimate control deck. It has been around since the very beginning of Hearthstone, and it's one of the strongest standing decks, and the reason it's such a strong standing deck is because it's good against everything. And the reason it's so good against everything is because it's of the threat of playing a big creature on every turn. And Handlock is just one of those all-time decks that I think is going to be staying around for a long time because it has so much synergy with all of the cards, and it's just such a strong and complete deck that I feel that it's going to be around for a while to come. So let's dive into the deck a little bit and see what we're running. In this particular build, we're running more of a demon Handlock, which is something that in the current meta is really strong because of the aggressive nature of the meta right now. The death rattle of the Void Caller that summons the demons is very threatening to aggressive decks, and it allows you to play a smaller creature on turn 4 with a death rattle into a very, very big creature. So it's something that is very threatening all the time, and we're just going to dive into this deck now. It's an expensive deck, costs a lot of dust. So first we have up is Mortal Coil. Mortal Coil is a 1 mana, 1 damage card that is basically a form of removal for early game. If your opponent is playing early game creatures, Mortal Coil is there to kill that early game creature as well as cycle through your deck. But it's not only useful in early game against aggro, it's also useful in mid game. When you trade up with your creatures, you want to use Mortal Coil and cycle through the deck without having to tap, things like that. So it's just a cycle card / removal card, which is really, really strong. Second, we have Dark Bomb, and Dark Bomb is another anti-aggro card that is there to basically try and stall early game, get rid of those knife jugglers, the Huffers of the world, the aggressive cards that Dark Bomb wants to remove so that Handlock can stabilize in that mid game. But if Dark Bomb, if you're playing in a control deck, playing against a control deck, Dark Bomb is just as valuable as well because of the ability. You have a lot of small minions. You run Ironbeak Owl, you run Sun Fury Protector, Earthen Ring, Argus, Void Caller. Those aren't very high attack creatures, and Dark Bomb allows you to trade up in control matches in instances where you probably wouldn't be able to trade up. So Dark Bomb is a really valuable card and a really strong removal for Handlock, as well as anti-aggro early game for you. So now we're moving on to Ironbeak Owl, which is a silence creature, and very important in Handlock because it allows you to, again, deal with early game creatures like Tempo Mage, that Flame Waker, or Mana Worm that needs to be silenced. It's silences Shielded Minibot, which is another common Paladin card being run right now. It gets rid of Sylvanas in control matches. It's just a very strong silence minion. So it's a very versatile double silence, and the reason that I think double silence is so good is because when you have one silence, you kind of are in a situation at times where you're deciding what is worth silencing. Do you want to silence for tempo? Do you want to silence for value? And when you run 2, like double Ironbeak Owl like this deck does, it allows you to silence for tempo and have that value silence for later in the game. An example I can give you off the top of my head is Shielded Minibot against Paladin. If you're in a situation where Paladin is just flooding the board early and you have an Ironbeak Owl in hand, you can just play the Ironbeak Owl and the Shielded Minibot and not have to worry about having that silence for Tyrion. Or you could silence a Shredder and not have to worry about silence for something else. Like that kind of a tempo silence. So double Ironbeak is very strong for Handlock. So moving on to Sun Fury, which is one of the core cards in Handlock. It's a taunt giver, which gives the adjacent minions taunt in your deck. And the reason that this is so strong is because you're playing big creatures on turns for low mana cost, like Mountain Giant and Molten Giant. And those type of cards are cards that you want to be able to taunt up and protect your face when you're at low health. And you also have death rattles from Void Callers like Jaraxxus and Mal'Ganis that you also would want to taunt up. You can even taunt up the Void Caller to force your opponent to have a silence. If he doesn't have a silence, you get the big death rattle off of your Void Caller. So Sunfury is a very important creature that you can taunt up your big creatures with and force your opponent to trade poorly into them. And it's also a card that some people argue that you can play early against aggro if your hand is really bad. You can just throw out the 2-mana 2/3 early and hopefully stall into the mid-game for you. So now we're moving on to Big Game Hunter, which is just a removal card for Handlock. Big Game Hunter's in almost every deck there is now, and at least one of him, and Handlock is no different. Control decks need removal, and that's what Big Game Hunter provides. We have Earthen Ring Farseer. Earthen Ring is a 3-mana heal, which is nice when you have the coin, because you tap on turn 2, and then your hand is usually full on turn 3. So you play the Earthen Ring, and then you can just draw on turn 4 without having to waste the 3 mana. But also, it is really versatile for healing your creatures as well. If you're trading with Mountain Giant or Jiraxis or something of that nature, you trade into a Sludge Belcher or something like that, you can heal your creatures back up to higher health, which will prevent them from dying to board clears, such as, off the top of my head, Flame Strike is one of them, Shadow Flame is another, Hellfire, things like that, Dark Bomb. Things that you can play around by healing your creature back up, and maybe the longevity of your creature during the game increases by a turn just because of the Farseer. So it's something that's a really valuable card that against aggro can also heal your face and sometimes buy you that one extra turn that you need in order to kill them. So moving on, we have Hellfire, which is a board clear for Handlock. Deals 3 damage to all characters, which is really strong against aggressive decks like Zoo in particular. You can clear the board and maybe, if you're lucky, put yourself low enough to Molten Giant so that you have a clear board against your opponent and a Molten Giant, which is a really, really strong turn. But if you can't get the Molten Giant out, at least you get the board clear with Hellfire most of the time. It removes a lot of damage by only giving yourself 3 damage. And sometimes can be used to set up lethal for yourself as well. So it's a versatile card that I think in an aggressive meta is a really, really, really good keep. Because it's just, you know, on turn 4 to deal 3 damage to everything is really strong because most of the creatures before turn 4 don't have higher than 3 health. Now moving on to Shadow Flame, which is a control board clear. If there's a more control style meta, I would recommend adding another Shadow Flame. It just destroys your friendly minions and deals that damage to the enemy. So it's really strong in Handlock because of the giants and the big creatures that you have here. You're able to do a full board clear with Molten Giant and Mountain Giant on your opponent's minions for tempo, or to survive an extra turn, try and get yourself that heal bot. Shadow Flame works really well in Handlock because of the giants. It just synergizes really well. So we have Argus, which is a higher cost Sun Fury. It does the same thing. It just puts up taunts on your big creatures. And Void Caller is a card that is back in Handlock. The reason that this card is so strong against aggro decks is because of being able to play a creature like Dread Infernal, Mal'Ganis, or Jiraxis on turn 4 with your death rattle of your Void Caller. It's just a really strong tempo swing. And these creatures, for example, this Mal'Ganis makes your hero immune, and Jiraxis has 15 health. So both of these are huge creatures if you get them onto the board. You can taunt Jiraxis, you can try and prevent your opponent from getting to Mal'Ganis with taunting up other creatures and stuff like that, keeping your hero immune, which is just a really, really strong play. And why Void Caller and the Death Rattle is back in Handlock and a really, really strong card. So moving on, we have Healbot. And Healbot is an important card in Handlock because, again, with the aggressive decks, Handlock's hero power, when you tap, you take 2 damage to your hero. So Healbot is an important card in order to be able to survive and have a long game, because of taking all that hero damage, you need to be able to sustain, and Healbot is basically what that is. It's a sustain card. When you get too low, you just Healbot back up, and it's a really, really strong play against aggressive decks and control decks to keep you out of that combo range, like Druid combo range or Patron combo range, even though Patron combo range is crazy. It just gives you that little extra health that maybe your opponent doesn't have the reach for. But it also synergizes well with Molten Giant because you can play a big creature for free, such as Molten Giant, and then go back up to 18 health, which is really frustrating for your opponent. So now we have Loatheb, and Loatheb is another strong creature. It's used against aggressive decks to prevent the reach with kill. with Kill Command or Quick Shot off the top of my head, or Fireball just gives you that extra turn to give you that health and survive, and maybe set up lethal with Loatheb, which is another strong play of Loatheb in control matches. Loatheb can be used to set up lethal against your opponent. When you have big giants on board, you can play Loatheb to prevent board clear and push your opponent down very quickly. So we have Sludge Belcher at another 5-drop here. So Sludge Belcher is a really commonly kept card because the stats are so strong and the death rattle is so good. It's just a big, hard to remove taunt in your deck. That handlock is just, it protects your creatures, it protects Mountain Giant, it protects your Mulligans if you have that on board. It just protects creatures. They can hide behind that Sludge Belcher, trade efficiently, stuff like that. But it also can be used to prevent your opponent from lethaling you because of it's a 3/7 5-drop, and not only that, it also has death rattle, so you have to trigger the death rattle before you can remove it, which can be tough at times for your opponent. And the Dread Infernal I've been running lately because of Paladins and because of the aggro decks. The Battle Cry is really, really strong and sometimes can be a board wipe in instances for yourself if you're running Dread Infernal. But I also run him because of his synergy with Void Caller. Because Dread Infernal is a demon, it death rattles. If you have Dread Infernal in your hand and Void Caller dies, it can put out Dread Infernal for you, and it can't be BGH'd. So it's a really strong card coming in off of the Void Caller, and just a really good all-around demon that I like to run. Then we have Dr. Boom, also known as Dr. GG. So why wouldn't you have him in your deck? He's just a really strong 7-drop, a big threat, another control card that you want to just stack your deck with late-game threats, and Dr. Boom is just another one for this deck. So now we have Jiraxxus, which is a demon, but he's also a late-game threat, as if you don't get him off of your Void Caller because of the death rattle, you can use him to heal yourself back up against aggro. So if you're really, really low and you top deck Jiraxxus, you can go back up to 15 health, which is really tough for your opponent to deal with. And in control matches, he makes 6/6 Infernos as his hero power, so he's really, really strong and can take over the board really, really quickly if you don't deal with him. And it synergizes with Void Caller, so he's really strong. Not to mention he has the 3-attack weapon when you equip him as your hero power, which is really strong. You're able to remove the board, take a little bit of damage, and because you have so much healing in your deck, you can just heal back up and not worry about dying. So Jiraxxus is one of those really, really strong late-game cards, which is what we're going to be seeing as a pattern here, these strong game cards, and Mulligans is another one. And it's also another demon. This is mainly run because of the Void Caller death rattle. It's just so strong, and it makes your hero immune. So Mulligans is a great card against aggro, especially early. It forces your opponent to trade into him, and if it's not in your hand, it can make your opponent think he is in your hand. So he's also like a mind game card. Just by running Void Caller, some people immediately think, oh my god, they have Mulligans, what do I do? So your opponent might play differently because of Void Caller in your deck. He might think you have Mulligans and start doing weird plays to try and play around Mulligans when in reality it's not helping him at all. So Mulligans is a lot of a mind game for your opponent and a really good card to run against aggro and something that is really, really strong. Alright, so now we're going on to the big boys. We have Mountain Giant, which is a really strong card in handlock because of your hero power. If you tap 3 times, this card becomes a 4-mana cost card, which is a really, really strong card. A 4-mana 8/8, which is just crazy strong, and why handlock is able to be so powerful. So Mountain Giant is one of the core cards in this deck, but if you can't get him out early, he's still a cheap minion late game, like a 4 or 5 mana cost 8/8, which will allow you to play something. And yeah, Mountain Giant, just a great card for handlock. It synergizes with your hero power. It also synergizes with Shadow Flame and Farseer and Sun Fury. It's just one of the core cards in your deck, and a really, really strong card. And the card that hit one of the 6 to 8 cards that handlock is built around. And then for last but not least, we have Molten Giant, which is costs 1 less for each damage your hero has taken. So he synergizes directly with the Warlock hero power as well. And he's a big boy, and a lot of the reason that handlock is such a strong deck against aggro is because of this card. When your opponent puts you really low, you can just drop both of these guys, heal bot up, and taunt them, and your opponent just sits there and Bible thumps all over the board because there's nothing he can do about 16 damage stats for free, and you're healing yourself and you're taunting, and This is, speaking of mind games about Mulligans, this is also a mind game card. Sometimes your opponent won't attack your face because he assumes you have Molten Giant, when in reality, your hand could be full and you don't have Molten Giant, but your opponent will play thinking you do have Molten Giant. So it can sometimes just, having the reputation of running Molten Giant is really, really strong because your opponent might respect it. Moving on to text that you can put in your handlock deck are things that are very meta dependent. So when we're talking about meta dependency in handlock, it's all about the state of the meta. Is it aggressive? Is it a control style meta? Is it more of a mid-range meta? Is it a fast meta? Is it a slow meta? And that's something you're going to have to assess for yourself. Currently, right now, this is a very fast meta and a very aggressive meta, which is why I'm running such an anti-aggro deck. Like this, I have my Coils, my Dark Bombs, my Owls, my Farseers, Double Hellfire, things like that. However, if the meta slows down, you can change it up a little bit. For example, a common tech in handlock would be Twilight Drake, which is a 4-mana dragon. So you cut the Void Caller, and you can put in Twilight Drake. That makes it a very strong card and high health creature that your opponent has to be able to answer. But when you cut the Void Caller, you're losing synergy with Dread Infernal, Jiraxxus, and Mulligans. So you want to get rid of these. You don't have to get rid of Jiraxxus and Mulligans. I would recommend getting rid of just Mulligans and Dread Infernal and keeping Jiraxxus, because Jiraxxus is very strong, even though he is the only demon. He's just a very strong 9-drop. So if you do run Twilight Drakes, one of the things about handlock is that they have a bunch of swing cards that you can play based on your playstyle. So Loatheb is a swing card that I like to play, that I will keep in. However, if you don't like Loatheb, you can also get rid of Loatheb. So some of the cuts that you might want to make are, if it's a heavy handlock meta, and there are a lot of handlocks, typically I like to run double BGH. And the reason I like to run double BGH sometimes is, again, it's based on the meta, and it's an evaluation that I'm making that there are a lot of control and control and mid-range type decks that warrant double BGH. I've also seen techs added such as Acidic Swamp Ooze. There are a lot of warriors, paladins, rogues in the meta. Ooze is something that some handlocks play, and the same will go for Harrison Jones. If there are a lot of weapon classes in the deck, then Harrison Jones is definitely a card that you want to consider running in your handlock, even though it draws you cards. Typically when you're in a warrior rogue type meta, you're most likely going to be drawing one card, which is usually fine and sometimes really good. But again, if you're worried about too much draw, you can just run Ooze, and Ooze will do just as well for you. So another card that a lot of people have been running is Emperor Thaurissan. So Emperor Thaurissan's really, really strong in handlock. And if you're not running a demon lock, it's something that I would definitely put in my handlock list. It's a card that reduces all the cost of your creatures, which is really, really strong. It allows you to do combos that sometimes you would not be able to. So something else, another 6-drop that a lot of people consider running is Sylvanas. Sylvanas is excellent because it synergizes with Shadow Flame. If you Shadow Flame Sylvanas, you can steal your opponent's creature as well as clear the board, which is really, really strong and sometimes overpowered. Also, a lot of people who don't run Farseers, you can cut Farseer if it becomes a little slower and add an Ancient Watcher if you like. Add Ancient Watchers back in. Ancient Watchers synergize with handlock a lot because of Shadow Flame, because of Ironbeak, and because of Sun Fury Protector. And they are also not too bad against aggro. So this is a list that you could possibly run if you wanted to change, because you could change the swing cards. And instead of having Loatheb and Mulligans and Void Callers, you could instead put Emperor, Sylvanas, and Ooze. But if there are not a lot of weapon matchups, you don't want this card. Instead, if the meta is slow enough, you can run a late game threat. Ragnaros is another good option. And to go over one more deck list with you, the dragon deck that I made for Handlock. So you can also tech it to Ysera from Magus. And instead of Belchers, you're going to run Corruptors. Oh, my last card was Loatheb. So this is a list that I ran to top 50 in the last season. So Handlock is strong again because of the versatility of it. You can make a lot of techs based on the meta and a lot of judgments, and there are a lot of versions. So, alright everybody, so now that we've gone through the overall use of the deck and the general idea of what you're trying to do with it, and we've also talked about the deck techs and the swing cards that you can add to your deck, now we're going to move on to the mulligan phase. And the mulligan phase is very important based on what type of deck you're playing against, and I think it's probably the most important part of Handlock is knowing what is good to keep in your hand and what is good to mulligan away. And the good Handlock players win most of their games because they have the answers to the cards that they need. Instead of not knowing what to have, they know exactly what they want, and I think that that's half of the battle when you're playing Handlock is knowing your mulligans. So I'm going to go over general, specific deck-by-deck analysis of what you should mulligan for. So let's start off against Warriors. A lot of the times against Warrior, you're going to want a hard mulligan for a Mountain Giant, and the reason that you're going to want a hard mulligan for a Mountain Giant is because we know that Warriors only run Execute the Patrons, and the Mountain Giants are really, really strong against Patron. Right now, Control Warrior is kind of out of the meta, but even if it is Control Warrior, Mountain Giant is very, very strong against that as well. So you want a hard mulligan for a Mountain Giant. And what hard mulliganing is mulligan all of your cards just to look for this specific one. Because it's so strong, it puts on so much pressure against a Warrior deck that is a really, really good card to have. So you want to look for Mountain Giants. Another card you want to look for in the matchup is Void Caller. Void Caller is very, very strong, and the reason that it's strong is because it's a 4-drop. And always threatens the dropping of other creatures behind it, which can mess up a warrior based on their shield slam and stuff like that. So you definitely want to look for Void Callers. Some things you might want to think about keeping are Ironbeak Owl, and I like to Ironbeak Owl Acolytes of Pain in warrior matchups because it prevents them from drawing, and it's really, really strong. You can basically just outdo your warrior opponent by Ironbeaking their Acolyte with all of your cards and preventing that card draw. So you basically want to look for your control cards, which are Void Caller and Mountain Giant. Those are the two cards you want. So just to review, you want Mountain Giants against Warriors and Void Callers, and maybe if you see an Ironbeak, keep that one as well. So moving on to Mage, we'll talk about mages. Most of them are Tempo Mage right now. And as a Handlock player, you want to mulligan for aggro if you are in a matchup, because the longer you wait, the more chance you'll have of drawing control cards. So if it's a control versus control matchup, you're going to be okay because you're going to be tapping early game. But if it's an aggro versus control matchup, you want to have the cards to be able to deal with your opponent if it is aggro. So against Mage, the cards that you want to look for are Hellfire to be able to clear the board on turn 4. Dark Bomb is very, very important, so you want to look for that card as well. Ironbeak Owl can be kept as well if you have that card. And Mortal Coil is sometimes good. Now, I would only keep one Mortal Coil. If I have 2 Dark Bombs, I would probably keep both of those. And I would only want 1 Ironbeak Owl as well. You don't want 2 of those, and you only want 1 Hellfire. But those are good cards to keep. And you could make an argument of keeping a Molten Giant, just to have that late game threat if he puts you too low. Just keep 1 Molten Giant. That can also be a good keep as well. Those are all good cards that you want to look for against a Mage. So moving on to Shaman. It's pretty much the same thing. Against all aggressive matchups, you really want to look for 1 Molten, a Hellfire. A Dark Bomb is super, super important against Shaman because of Whirling Zap-O-Matic and your Ironbeak Owl. Those are your really strong anti-aggro cards that you really want to look for. And Mortal Coil as well. Those are your key anti-aggro cards. Are these top 6? Molten and Hellfire. Those are your really, really strong anti-aggro cards. So also against Rogue. Rogue is a control matchup most of the time. So in your control matchups, you want to look for Mountain Giant and Void Caller. Basically against Rogue with this deck, you want a hard mulligan for Mountain Giant because it puts a lot of pressure on Rogue. and is able to clear the board easily. Hemlock is fairly simple. Most of the time you just want, in control matches, you want to look for your Mountain Giants and your Void Callers, and in aggressive matchups you want to look for your Dark Bombs, your Coils, your Ironbeak Owl, and your Molten Giant to try and deal with their aggression and make it to the mid game. That's basically the idea in this scenario. So for Priest, it's the same thing. You want to look for Mountain Giants and Void Callers. And against other Warlocks, you really want to look for Hellfire and Dark Bomb. Those are really, really important. Ironbeak and Mortal Coil are good as well. I would keep Ironbeak if you're playing against a Warlock. That's really good. I would keep one of them. You want Dark Bomb and Hellfire. Mortal Coil is not as good against Zoo as it used to be. Molten, Hellfire, Ironbeak, and Dark Bomb are all really good cards against other Warlocks. Druids, you want to look for Mountain Giants. Hard Mulligan for Mountain Giants. Void Callers are really good as well. Those two cards are really important. You want to look for your 4-drops against Druids. One thing against Druid, you want to keep a Molten Giant if you can. Molten Giant against Druid is really, really strong, and that's a card you definitely want to keep. And yeah, that should cover the Mulligan phase. If you guys have any questions, don't forget to leave a comment below, and we can move on to the gameplay. Alright, so when you're going against Mage, you really want to look for anti-aggro cards. Coil is a good one to keep. You want to look for Dark Bomb, Molten Giant, Hellfire, those types of things. Cards you do not want are Dr. Boom and Jiraxxus. Those are very bad against aggro. Mal'Ganis is a card you don't want against aggro. So this hand is generally pretty awful. Alright, this is the worst anti-aggro hand in history. This is exactly what you do not want. He could be Freeze Mage, though. I'm desperate enough where I'm gonna double coil this. My hand is very, very, very bad. Twilight Drake. Okay, I'm gonna play Giant. If it's Entity, it's Entity. I don't think it's Entity. I think it's Duplicate. So we got Sheeped. Belcher's a good one. We can play Belcher here. Just attack face. Belcher forces a ping from him, which is nice. Keeps my sheep alive. Allows me to trade, and then Dread Infernal. Let's coin here. We'll play Dr. Boom. I'm not gonna kill his Drake. I don't need to kill it yet. He's not playing anything. The longer my Dr. Boom lives, the less he's gonna play something. I mean, the longer his Drake lives, the less he's gonna play something. Okay, so let's trade here and see where the Boombot goes. So we'll kill this. Give him the Twilight Drakes. And we'll tap. Nothing I can play, really. Man is generally pretty awful. Okay. Blackwing Illuminator. So we could do this. I'll play our Dread Infernal. Okay, we did draw the Ironbeak, which is nice. So we'll punish him by playing Belcher and Ironbeak. So we are going to tap first. There's a chance we get blown out by Flame Strike here. So I'm gonna Earthen Ring this, Iron Beak that, and then Sun Fury. This way if he Flame Strikes, we don't get completely blown out. Just kinda blown out. Of course I'm dead to double Fireball Frostbolt, but I don't think they run Fireballs. Oh boy, Echo sucks. So I'm gonna play my Jiraxxus. Just so I can start making 6/6s. So that's the only way I'm gonna win this game, is if I just continually make threats. I can't win in a value game because I don't have enough creatures. Oh, there's a chance I'm dead right here. Okay, I didn't get it. So we blow him out. Which is exactly the tempo swing that we kind of needed. So I have 16, 18, and 21. I can't quite blow him out. So we can clear these, or we can just ignore them. I like doing this and getting value out of my low health creature. And then I can play an Inferno. And heal this one. Because this one dies to Flame Strike anyway. We'll go face. Now if he Flame Strikes, he's forced to ping this instead of play anything else. Because I think it's pretty obvious he has Flame Strike. Wow. Coil's a great draw. Although he should have pinged this and played Coil. Well, that's greedy. So I can pop his Ice Block. And play Mulligans. That way I don't die. So we're gonna do that. So he has to deal with the board and play Ice Block. He can still Flame Strike me, but if he Flame Strikes me, he's dead. Okay, that's a Flame Strike equivalent. Alright, got him. Woo!